The whole thing is open. The planning is still in process. And so what I'm going to again is brainstorming so she's basically on the road and that's one of her projects. They were there with their brother, yet the school was open and running. What fascinated me was again the background of the truce, the treaty, and then later the Civil War days. And again, how the school managed to function and how those two ladies managed to continue to teach and at the same time keep their whole interest in their political life going as well in Ireland. Fascinating women in that. So that's the kind of, I suppose, if you like, context of today's talk as well. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm drawing a lot from a number of areas. Of course, MacSwiney Brugha's own book, History's Daughter. I spoke to Cathal about it last night. What a wonderful, wonderful human story it is, and as well an insight into history. So I've drawn from that. I had a chance to look at Mary's papers for an earlier talk that we did in 2017 above a new CD, and they were fascinating. I would have loved to have got there for the last few weeks, but my mum isn't too well at the moment, so it's a bit tight to do things like that. And we have some wonderful stuff from our own book, Ordinary Women in Extraordinary Times, Geraldine Neeson's experiences working in the school, Scoileatha. And I was also very fortunate in a talk, and that's the wonderful thing about history talks, is you don't know who you meet. And we were at a talk on the MacSwiney women, Mary and Annie and Muriel below in Glounthaune. We were giving the talk, and at the end of it, this lady came up to me and she said, "My name is Jane Dowdall. My grandmother was Jenny Dowdall. She was the first Lady Lord Mayor of the city." And she said, "I have lovely stuff belonging to my father who went to school in Scoileatha." So she's provided me with a lot of the photographs and the school reports and things for this morning, so I hope that's okay. So without further ado, we get started. So bear with me because I am not an IT expert. Okay, so Mary MacSwiney, she was given, I suppose, people that were in the know gave her the title the last true Republican, and others used it in a sarcastic way, but I'm using it in a very positive way because that was how she felt she remained true to her ideals to the last. Now, in terms of her education, she herself was born in England, as probably most of you know, in the 1870s, and she was the eldest in a family of 7. And I was speaking to Cathal last night, and I said that one thing that struck me about it was that it was a very interesting family setup. That given the timing of it, the 19th century and into the early 1900s, that family never made a distinction between male or female. Mary was the eldest, so she was the head of the family, not because she was, it didn't matter that she was the girl or the boy. And within that family, there was such, I suppose, an emphasis put on education among themselves, that what fascinated me was that in the family of 7, all were educated to as high a standard as they could achieve. And the girls in particular were educated to a very, very high standard, including 3rd level, which was fascinating for the era that that they come from. And when you think of their parents, John and her mother, they were both very much involved in education as well. So it's the way it permeated down. It's really interesting. She herself, when they came back to Cork, she did a lot of her secondary school in St. Angela's, and she was really a very solid pupil there, and really her intellect marked itself out from the beginning. And also, I think as well, her primary education was in England, and that did give her a sense of a broader view of education than, say, maybe the Irish education system would have given her. And I think she carried that into her own school later. And even the structure of the school, as we see, it was very much a blend of continental and English systems, as well as the Irish system. She went on from St Angela's College to go on to a third level back to England and to Cambridge. And it was in Cambridge that she did her Bachelor Arts, and she also did her teaching diploma. Again, it was a fascinating, development for a woman in her time, and truly revolutionary in that way. Like, women were beginning to make the mark and going into universities like that to do third level education. She taught in Farnborough in a school that was run by the Benedictine nuns for quite a while. Her own areas were Latin and history, they were her big areas. But I discovered recently from an essay, you mentioned the essay competition, an essay that a student in St Angela's had written for their kind of contribution to 2016. That she had actually taught maths as well in St Angela's when they needed. She was really, I suppose, that type of teacher that you were asked to, look, there's a class there, go in and fill it, and she was that, she had that gift, I think, and Maire makes the point in her book, and I think there, kind of when you get a sense of a person, I think she probably would have stayed on with the Benedictines, possibly joined them, because she had a great sense of spirituality herself. But for twists of fate that happened to her, as happened to all of us in our lives, and they bring her on a really important road, and that is the road back to Ireland, and especially the road back to Cork, and that was the death of her mother. And again, it was like something that she shouldered that responsibility, and she just packed up, came home to look after the other 6 siblings. And it wasn't just that she based herself in the house, which I thought was really interesting, because there's lots of stories of women doing that, powerful women, who kind of put their own lives to one side and just ran the house, ran the home, became the mother for the others. She did that, and she also earned for them. In other words, she continued with her teaching, which again, in my mind was, if you're looking for revolutionary, you don't have to go into the political sphere. In terms of social expression, that was, to my mind, a really groundbreaking thing that she did. And again, it showed the independence of mind, which is something I've come to really appreciate about Mary and Annie in their thinking. She is lucky in that her own alma mater takes her on, and she teaches in St Angela's right up to 1916. And again, as I said, it was Latin and history and a little bit of maths as well. But it was the impact of local and national politics on her during this period when she comes back to Cork that was to be the formative influence on her. I'll just flick again. So when she's in Cork, she gets very involved with the suffrage movement, and she's one of the founding members of the Munster Munster Franchise League. And very interestingly, I only discovered this recently because our current talk in the history group, we kind of prepare one every year, is on Mary Elms. And I discovered that Elizabeth Elms, the mother of Mary, and Mary MacSwiney were actually quite friendly. And they had served together in the Munster Franchise League. Elizabeth held an office in it, and so did Mary MacSwiney. And Mary Elms herself carried with her memories of the deaths of McCurtain and MacSwiney, and there were again another influence in her life, which was just an interesting sideline there. But for me, for Mary MacSwiney, it was interesting, and Cathal referred to it last night. She was in the suffrage movement, but she was never a suffragette in that sense. Again, she took a broader picture that the vote for women was part of the whole picture. It wasn't just the road itself. And she referred to it that the vote for women was a matter of justice. It wasn't, just a separate issue. It was, if anybody had a thinking brain or a thinking mind, well, like, they should have the vote. It's a sense of natural justice. And I think that's where, along with other women, that when some for the First World War, in Mary's case for the national cause in 1916 and in the War of Independence, that she subsumed the question of the rights of women into the national question, because I think she felt, a bit like Connolly, that the cause of Labour was the cause of Ireland and so on, that they were indivisible in her mind. She also joined the Gaelic League in Cork, developed a beautiful, really beautiful love for the language and the connection for it. And for myself, I mean, I love the language, but my fluency, once you leave school, that's it. And it's an awful indictment, isn't it, that you learn a language for 12 years and then it's gone from you because you're not exercising it. But she actually came into my mind about that, because her attitude to the language was, if you've only a couple of focal, use them. You know, you don't have to be the Gael goer, you don't have to have the whole flow and feel uncomfortable. And again, Carl referred to it last night about the fact that herself and Annie spoke with kind of Oxford English accents. And there's a quote where it says, "Here come the two Republican ladies speaking in their Oxford accents," you know. But they spoke Irish as what they had, and they went off to learn it in Dún Queen and pick up what they could in and around the Kerry Gaeltacht. And they brought that into their school as well, as we'll see with their teaching of languages. So she was never a fluent speaker herself. In the volunteer movement, I think her house where the family were living, Terence was involved, Sean was involved, she became involved in the volunteer movement, and particularly involved in the parallel organisation Cumann. And that's a wonderful story, but a story for another day. But again, into it in terms of organisation administration. A brilliant, not just an intellect that she had, but she had a capacity for organisation and administration that was really, really set her apart, really. And she was involved with the national movement of Cumann, but in Cork itself, she was in at the beginning, and some of the very early meetings took place in her own home. And she was a formative influence there. And it was, you know, I found when I was researching her essay for the book, it was a great, it must have been a great distressing time when the treaty came and they split, the Cumann split in Cork particularly very, very stridently over the treaty, and former friends, former colleagues, you know, it was I suppose a symbol of the way the treaty divided people. But that was her role in Cumann. Now, Annie MacSwiney then, she was also known as Ethna, that was her name. She was the younger sister of Maire. She wasn't the youngest in the family, but she was of the, if you like, my grandmother always talks about that she had two families, the older fellas and the younger fellas in a large family. And Annie was in that second half of the family. She went on to do third level at Newman College, which has been in the news recently because of the canonisation of John Henry Newman. And when we were in Leaving Cert, one of our stalwart essays that we had to learn as part of our course in English in North Pres was the idea of university. Sister Margaret Mary would not let you leave the school until you had read that essay from cover to cover and to know what Newman had to say. So I thought it was really interesting, again, the connections that the way they all tie up. And it became UCD. Now Annie, when she went to UCD, it was science. She was educated in, that was her degree, in science. And later she was to teach that in the school along with maths and arithmetic and that to the juniors as well. Now she also went back to England, and where the family had kind of, if you like, had their original roots. And she taught on the Isle of Wight for many years. And she taught again with the Benedictine nuns there. Most of her students were continental students who had come to boarding school, Catholics from different parts of Europe, but particularly Germany and Austria. And she formed a great bond with them. And I actually, it's in Maire's book as well, but I actually came across people who remembered her teaching their family members, and they had a great connection with her and kept writing to her all their lives, which gives an idea of what quality of teacher she was. And her niece Maire makes that point, that she was a wonderful, wonderful teacher and communicator. She also kept with the connections. She was later to use those connections to encourage her niece Maire to go back to Germany, to improve her German and keep the German that she had learned when she was there as a youngster. And it was these students that she had taught opened up their doors to Maire later, which again, it's lovely to see that connection and that. Interesting enough, for a science student and later a science graduate, Annie MacSwiney retained a lifelong love of English literature, particularly Shakespeare and Charles Dickens, and of course the Oxford accent comes in there. And she, that was a core thing in the school, that they were all encouraged to do big pieces from Shakespeare, learn the great speeches, and put on the plays as well. So again, this broadness of view, that even though they were in a sense Irish nationalists and very much involved in the Irish Republican movement, their sense of education went broader than, you know, just a very narrow, rigid view of education system. Would they were with us today? But anyway, she came back to Ireland around 1916. I had to come across the stuff and I thought she'd come earlier, but I'm open to think on that. And in Maura's book she said she did come back when Mary rang her, or contacted her rather, to come back because of the problems with 1916 and that she had lost her job, as we'll see in a minute. Now, I think Annie comes back to a family home that is immersed in Sinn Féin and nationalist politics. And it is really a turbulent time, both in the home and outside the home, and she is drawn into that. She joins Cumann Amon. She also has a lifelong love of the Irish language. Again, not very fluent in it, but that didn't stop her from loving it and encouraging the children in the school to use, again, the language they had. Interestingly enough, she was actually sent to, I came across evidence that she was sent to Dublin by MacSwiney and McCurtain to McDermott and Clark to meet with them and find out what the hell is going on. Are we to rise up in Cork, or what should we do? Would they meet with us and all of that? So she had a little role in that part of the 1916 rising, and she brought that information of, you're being followed, those boys are being watched, we do not want to connect with you. And of course, the lack of information flowing was a big issue, as we know, in the collapse of the rising. The arrests of her two siblings, Mary and Terence, really affected her. I think it put her under great strain, and there were a huge trial for her because she didn't know, particularly with Terence, where was he being held. And then when he's transferred to England, where was he being held? There. So there was a lot of tension over that, a lot of worry. And in terms of her sister, like her sister was the head of the house, her sister was the breadwinner, where was she when she was arrested? She herself was under surveillance, and at some point or other the house was invaded by RIC, accompanied by British soldiers, and she was interrogated alone in that house and had to, hold the line and keep her mouth shut as such. I found that very, very difficult, very stressful as well. In 1916, Mary's attitude to the rising was a very critical one, which got her into trouble later, particularly with none other than Bishop Collin, who was to use it against her, saying like she was a latter-day come Republican. But actually, if we take a step back from that and we look at her actual criticism of it, it showed the intellect of the woman. In that she looked at the city of Cork and the way it's surrounded by hills, and it's, goes down into the valley, into like a saucer shape, if you like. And she realised that the key barracks, Victoria Barracks, was on the hill, and that all the military had to do was ring the hills and they could isolate the rebels. And that's what she said later. She said that the planning of it, if you like, the strategy of it wasn't going to work. And the planning of it, the connection with Dublin and that was so, there was such a lack of information that she felt that they were putting themselves out there only to fail, and that they would rue that. So I thought there was a lot of, from my personal point of view, there was a lot of intellect and good thinking about that, but she was hammered for it later, as a strong woman often is, but anyway. She also felt the consequences of arrests and upheavals in the city, not just for her brother, not just for her sister, but she herself. She was in the classroom, teaching maths to the Leaving Cert cycle, what would be the Leaving Cert cycle now, and in this essay that this student Emma wrote, she identified that they were all aghast. They could hear the boots marching down the corridor, classroom door open, Mary is arrested there, handcuffed and brought out down through the corridor. You can imagine the scene. And of course, a lot of the pupils in St. Angela's had connections to Victoria Barracks because they were daughters of the officers of the British Army there. It was a very tricky time. And this is where it began to impinge on Mary. She lost her job because of her Republican connections and her family connections to Terence as well. And I just love this quote from her, which I came across in her papers. And she made this statement to the American Commission, which was sent there by De Valera with Muriel in 1920 after Terence's death, to kind of raise awareness of what was going on in Ireland. And she said, "The nuns were personally very fond of me, but they highly disapprove of my political opinions, and they were very nervous at having them in that exceedingly respectable school." And then the Reverend Mother tried to get around her. And they were friends, actually, and I love that about her, She could actually be friendly with people, but what she had to say to you, she said to you, and that was it. But she said to the Reverend Mother said to her, "Look, we're over quota, and I have to cut down on teachers." Well, that doesn't apply to me. She said, "I'm a senior teacher," and so there was a bit of spluttering thing. She said, "Reverend Mother, you're dismissing me because I'm an Irish Republican." And that was it, and she moved on from there. Now, that would have affected a lesser woman, I think, personally. You're looking after 6 other siblings. you're trying to run the house, you're trying to keep the house paid for, and your job is gone. And you're gone with dismissal. Not by choice, you're gone by dismissal. And even in today's terms in teaching, very difficult to get another job if that was your situation. So what do these two ladies do, Mary and Annie? They don't sit back and they don't go, oh my God, where am I going to go? They look to one another for strength. And they get support from their Republican friends and they say, do you know what, no, we'll open our own school. And hang them, I have to say that. So that's what they did. In 1916, they established a school, St. Ita's, but it very gradually became known as Scoil Ita, and it lasted until 1954. And that's the little inscription that I have on the bottom of the slide there. This is the building. It's still existing today in Belgrave Place, and if you're ever in Cork and you go up to McCurtain Street, go towards the, I suppose, the Coliseum end of McCurtain Street, and there's a fine big hill that'll test your heart, York Hill. Go up York Hill and you'll come onto Belgrave Place and you'll see the house. And it's now a hostel. It's called Sheila's Hostel. But it has a little plaque on the wall still which says Bunaha ag Maire agus Ethna Nixivna. So it's still there in memory of where they established. This photograph was taken, and I confirmed it with Cathal last night, it was taken in the grounds of the school, and it gave us a little interesting insight in that the two books that they're holding are both religious texts. They sent it to their niece Maire while she was living in Germany, and he thinks there was a little secret message to her to, you know, don't lose faith. So it's a beautiful, I love it as a photograph, and Cathal kindly gives a beautiful one for the book that is the full-length one, so, you know, it's a lovely one. Okay, so what was Scoil Ita in terms of education? And as an aside to that, I just want to just give you a little anecdotal evidence that happened to me. In 2017, we were asked by the Mother Jones Summer School to give a talk on Mary and Annie and Muriel. And we did. And at the end of the talk, this lady put up her hand to ask a question, and she stood up, and her first thing was, I'm a Scoil Ita girl. And now she was an elderly lady. The next thing, it was like something out of the film Spartacus. This lady said, I'm from Scoil Ita, I'm from Scoil Ita, my mother was from Scoil Ita, and their warmth about the school fascinated me. Considering that it closed in 1954, and this is 2017 that we're talking about, their warmth and feeling of the school was just, it just floored me. I thought there was no place like North Pres, but obviously Scoil Ita was. But, and this is what I gathered from them in their conversations, that the school was a testament to these two ladies, their defiance of obstacles put in their way, and this can't happen and that can't happen, and they just stood. Their determination that they would get on with life and that they would work in this school to build their approach to, I suppose, education, if you like, and their dedication. And that's what all these past pupils had in their memory of Mary and Annie as educators, that it was their dedication as teachers. That, you know, it's very hard in today's world where people are kind of working 9 to 4 and you're all at Crow Park hours and all this sort of stuff. And that's why I mentioned Margaret Mary earlier. These teachers that kind of filled us with love and passion for not just our subject but for life, and who gave us that sense of that if you were going to do something, do it well and do it really well. All these students that I met that night, and it was a privilege to meet them, they just had that same sense that they both had dedication to their work and to the school, but that's what they gave them in their lives. Grant, thank you. They lived on, it was a very broad curriculum base. It was enlightened teaching in the sense that they had a whole range of subjects. They didn't just do, which they did, English, maths and Irish, but they broadened into, they had a whole cultural studies package of music, art, drama. They also had modelling with clay. They had a kind of creative arts. It was based, I thought, very much on a kind of a continental model of kindergarten stroke nursery school and then primary and secondary school. And I hope it's next. Yeah, this is, I'm very grateful to John Mulcahy from Whitechurch History Society who sent me this. This is the first advertisement of the school in the local newspapers. And you can see there it's called St. Ita's High School, and kindergarten. And it uses the phrase kindergarten, which is, you know, quite a continental phrase. I found that really interesting. But if you come down to where it says school hours, this I thought was a real gem. And in their structuring of the day of their children, this is what they did. They said, the system has been adapted on medical advice. And this is their school. They ran a morning school from 9 to 12:30, to which all the students would go, including the youngest, the nursery kids. Then they would have an afternoon school from 2:30 to 4 for juniors, half 2 to 4 for seniors, but no nursery school after that. They were light years ahead of their time in thinking like that, and in taking on, as I say, medical advice to what could a child cope with in a day. And even in the afternoon school, they used that not for more and more and more learning, but for absorbing what you've taken in the morning, for preparation for exams and for home study. Which again was light years ahead of the thinking. And I was only listening recently to a psychologist speaking about, you know, the way we have our kids are all now, you know, they're up at the dawn with us, they're into their creches or they're into their schools, and we might see them again at 7 o'clock at night, and this kind of circle that goes on and on and on. And here were these two ladies who never had children themselves, but who were light years ahead in their thinking, I thought anyway, in their laying out of the school. Okay, that's just a little example of one of the, and the reason I put it in, it came from, I think it's one from the Dowdalls, I'm not certain now, but it gives you, look at dates from 1919, Christmas play, the beautiful Irish script, and yet the play was an English drama, and it was about Sir Thomas More. So there again was the breadth of the ability to bring into the school something that wasn't intrinsically Irish, but put an Irish slant on it by having the programme in Irish, but the play was very much English, was about Sir Thomas More. So this is some of their subjects. I just want to drop down here. They had a huge emphasis on language, Latin, French, German and Irish. And Irish was taught by the aunt of Maire Oak's great friend, Maire de Rochester. And they had a huge emphasis on geography and history. But it's the bottom level, these two ones that the students that I spoke to had the most memory of, their element of citizenship that was taught in the school. And they all said to me, it wasn't that it was intrinsically Republican, it was about love of country. It was about service to one's country. Long before John F. Kennedy ever stood on the platform and said, ask not what your country can do for you. These two ladies were inculcating in their students from the smallest to the oldest, that you had to have a love of your place, you had rights as citizens, but you had duties as citizens. And they tried to inculcate that in their school as well. Carl referred to last night about the fact that they were taught never to tell lies. And I found out with the students that I met, they said to me that they would work. They knew if you were you kind of shift from foot to foot if you were trying to tell a mistell, and that they were always taught honesty and integrity. But the big thing was about a good name. And when you look at world politics today and what passes for respectable discourse with each other, I'm not talking about whether we agree or disagree with people. That's a healthy thing. But these ladies were encouraging the idea that you would never take another person's name, because once you took the name, you could never repair that damage, no matter how much you disliked the person or anything, which I thought, again, coming from where, you know, they endured a lot of criticism in their own lives, this was a very powerful thing for them. And also these ladies told me that religious studies were a huge thing, but they loved the way religion was taught in the school. And again, it was Mary and Annie taught the religious studies. And they prepared the children for First Communion. That's just a little, I'll come back to that in a minute. I'll go back, sorry. They prepared, let's hope that we go. Yeah, sorry now. I'm a bit confused now. Yeah, sorry. They prepared the kids for religious studies, but their attitude to religion was, again, ahead of its time. They were both very devout Catholics, but they took it in the sense of the Christian message generally. And they didn't subscribe to the idea that, which was a big thing at the time in doctrinal issues, that the Catholic Church was the one true church. They believed in the concept that Christian thinking and Christian churches all had that sense of goodness in them. So they had Jewish backgrounds, and they also had First Communion classes and confirmation classes, which they themselves conducted, and brought then the local priest from St. Patrick's Church in to teach the kids at various times, or to examine them to see whether they're on the right track. And it was a matter, these ladies told me, it was a matter of great pride, particularly to Annie, that when the diocesan inspector would come, that they would all pass with flying colours. That to her, they were the top school in Cork for religious instruction, and they hadn't a religious teacher in terms of a priest or a nun among them. So that was a great thinking of them. But I just want to go forward to their religious thinking there. The Christian spirituality. This is photographs that were provided to me by the Dowdalls, and they're beautiful of them all in the white, as you can see, and great joy of the occasion. And it was, the event took place in St. Patrick's Church. But this is just what I wanted to say about them. They respected the institutional church, but they weren't cowed by it. And that was a huge thing when you consider the timing. I'm talking about the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, Ireland, which was very much, hand in heart with the Catholic Church. They respected it, but they weren't cowed by it. They had a broad view of Christian goodness. They had yes to the Eucharist and to Mass, and the kids were encouraged to go to Mass and all of that. But in their teaching in the school, they had a very quiet but firm ecumenism in their teaching, which I found fascinating, given the timing of it. And they were years ahead of their time. Now, both women encouraged or encountered very tough responses from the church at various times. And Cathal referred to Mary's issue with Bishop Collin last night about, again, calling out on her good name about misappropriation of funds, and later with Donogh the Barra's funeral. But Annie MacSwiney herself also encountered it. They were both excommunicated for their republicanism, and yet they were devout Catholics. Now, I've been practicing myself, but if you miss it, you miss it. But to them, the Mass was everything, and to be separated from that, was a huge thing. So what they ended up doing was, Annie went to Mass and confession, and this young priest was giving it to her, and obviously somebody took him aside and said, "You can't give it to her, she's excommunicated." So when she went down the next day, he said to her, I can't give you absolution, Miss MacSwiney," he said. "You're a Republican." And she said, "Father, I confess only my sins, not my virtues. I consider my Republican principles to be one of my virtues." And I just loved that response, It wasn't disrespectful, but it was independent thinking. And I was saying, "Listen here, boy, back down, I'm coming." And neither of the two of them ever stopped, going to Mass or whatever like that. I just want to go back. I know I'm almost run out of time. This little letter, I love it. It was given to the Dowdalls about their little son, Fionn Barra. And it was about his first communion day. And it's handwritten. And it says, "To Mr. and Mrs. Dowdall, Acharda. The first communion Mass will take place at 9 a.m. Saturday, May the 22nd. Will you please have Fionn Barra at the porch of St. Patrick's Church at 8:50 a.m. Now, I've been involved in communion classes, and I can tell you that doesn't happen. When my sister will meet the children and take charge of them. After Mass, they return here for breakfast. And we should be very pleased if you will both come and share a light breakfast with the children, as we always wish the parents to be closely associated with the children on this day." And there again was the connection of that this wasn't just a separate thing, this was a whole family celebration. And the simplicity of it was beautiful, really beautiful. And there's just a little, just one thing, and I'll just show it you before I finish up. This is Fionn Barra's, a couple of his reports, and he did all right, in 1936. He was just around communion age, and she had listed all the subjects here, and it was the beautiful Irish script, hand done by Maire MacSwiney. It was done as Gahanara, the old one, and very good then in the English form. But it's the list of subjects fascinated me. First up is conduct, then order, then religious knowledge, then the academic subjects. So it was the person came first. Their sense of who they were, their spirituality came first, and then that. But the one before it is beautiful. He was only after joining school, so he was a little toddler, and I loved that idea of, like, he's only a baby, no pressure. Fionn Barra is not here long enough to get a report. But we are quite sure he will be a very good boy and become a great scholar. Now that's wonderful for any parent to get. And again, the thinking behind it, I'm not being condescending, but I'm thinking about it as a teacher myself and watching the point system and all of that. Here was a lady who looked at this in the long term. This boy had a long road to go, so he was starting at a nice place. There's no need for a report. He's doing all right. And I'll just finish with, just very quickly, the school, unfortunately, after the 1930s, 1940s, it ran into very tough times because it wouldn't take, neither Annie nor Mary would ever take any state grants from the Free State. They would never sign up. They were an unregistered school. Their staff were undesignated, which meant they had no entitlements. Yet, they held the loyalty of that staff, which was really interesting. And they were paid, the staff were paid, but not in a great sense, and their pension situation was a bit of a problem. Mary and Annie and even Maire themselves never ever took a proper salary from that school. The school came first, then their own needs. It's just a little photograph of the two of them in their sitting room there, and you can see it's old-fashioned, it's cosy, but that was it. They never, you know, they weren't the grandiose type of women at all. They were focused on the school. Geraldine Neeson herself talks about it, that Maire would often come into that room with a lot of worried frown on her, and that was both her political life but also her school life. And I better finish now, yeah, am I okay? Maire was the first, or Mary was the first to go. Her health, deteriorated rapidly. I think a lot was due to the hunger strikes she'd been on during the Civil War. That does leave its mark, obviously. She died in 1942, but I just think, and I hope it's okay, Carl, that I quote this, when I read the book first, I thought, if my son can say that about me, I'd be truly grateful. But Maire, I don't think you would know at the moment, but Maire was the first person to give me true love. I'd spent 10 years under her care. Looking back, I can truly say I never met another character to surpass her, and she also praises the level of intellect she had. Annie continued the school, but this is one of the things that struck me most when these students spoke to me at the end of that talk. They told me that Annie stepped up as Privida, and they would address her as Privida, and she would say, "Last Privida, Privida is in here." That Maire, she carried Maire in her heart all the time. She would never identify herself as principal. And I finished then. She died herself, ill health. The school had to be reorganised under Maire Oak. She tried very much to get it back on a steady footing, but Annie's ill health really, and her, you know, she wasn't a great manager in that way, it really brought an end to the school. It was closed in 1954 and transferred to Scolmwira, where they had a student who had now set up her own school, Scolmwira, and this is the ad in the paper that says the closing of Scolita, and all of the pupils would be incorporated. And I leave you finally with just a tiny verse from Gabriel Fitzmaurice, who remembered the 100 years of Mary High School, but the last verse sums up Mary and Annie. The teachers of a country are its well. The seeds they water blossom into fruit, fruit of all our labours. May it tell of love that gently nurtured it in youth, that asks for no reward, except to know the glory and the pain of letting go. So that's a very quick story.
Thank you very much, Dan. And as Aidan, our chairman, said at the beginning there, rather than take questions now, we'll invite Sinead McCoole to give our second paper this morning, and I'll open the floor to questions to both speakers thereafter for a few minutes.
I'm just trying to get this out. Not very good. I just put it out. Will you look after that? Thanks, Sinead. Thanks, Sinead.
the invitation has been here for quite a while, and obviously this is my area of interest, and thank you, Anne, for just such a fabulous paper. I could listen to you all morning. I just think I also wanted to respond to you also, if I may, very quickly, and say to you one of my favourite quotes is a quote from Anna Parnell, and she said, "The greatest independence is the independence of the mind." I'd also like to respond to Cathal and to Catherine and say to them that I've always loved this book. It's such a beautiful book. If you like books, you rub books. Yeah. So I've always rubbed this book. Yeah. And it was so beautifully illustrated. But what I would say to you is its impact was tremendous, because what it did was it was a counterblast to the story of Mary MacSwiney. And Mary MacSwiney gets a very bad press in terms of how she's seen in the history books. And again, I suppose what I'd say to you, that's not the subject of my talk today, but I feel really strongly about it. And I think that it's the importance of the decade of commemorations, that we have a complexity, and a complexity of history, but also family history has come to play so much of a part. And by the generosity of the families for allowing their personal material to go into the public domain has meant so much for our deeper understanding of people. And one of the things about my talk, which will become very clear, is the dearth and the lack of papers and information about people who are so important, and where the knock-on effect for that is for history. But I would like to sort of say, in relation to the understanding, I thought educators was such an important theme for this this topic, because in terms of the belief of the women, which came out very much from this talk, it wasn't just an interest in history, it was an interest in Irish manufacture, it was an interest in people staying at home and having jobs in Ireland, an understanding of Irish people that could be whole and educated, because they saw the links right back into times where Irish people couldn't get education, and obviously this is paid or free, education for people, so there was a cost. And so it cost a lot to send your children to outside of the system, in the same way that PH Pierce had done. But that's just a response to that wonderful paper, and I'd just like to say that. And I hope you don't mind me saying this at the outset. I was thinking of saying it till the end, but I really just want to say it, because I really feel it's very important. What struck me about your poster today, I'd like you to reflect on it based on our papers in relation to women. Our understanding of the independence movement now and the role of women in the War of Independence is that they were the eyes and ears, they were the people who risked their lives, and it came again out in terms of interrogations and things that happened to women, that I would ask for you, perhaps, would you look again at your poster and include a woman in that particular image. And again, I know that's slightly controversial, but I just want to think about it. So I'm going to start off and talk to you about the story of Kate Murphy's record. And so what the story in relation to education, I need to talk a little bit about the family who came from this place. And my talk was from OrLissarda to Limerick. And I grew up in Limerick, and so I've always had a huge interest in KHAA, because I walked the streets that she walked. Her sisters lived in the area in which I grew up. And I think what's very interesting is I didn't know of them growing up, but their lives had touched mine, and that's really something that I want to talk about today. They were the Murphy sisters that I'm going to concentrate are only three of a family of what are said to be 8 girls and 6 boys. But I haven't been able to find from the records the details of all of those children. And what's interesting is there was a letter that was submitted into Kilmainham jail from a Sean Murphy, who was a nephew of Kate O'Callaghan, and for many years that was the only object that I knew that related to her, and it was a book that Kate O'Callaghan had read while she was in prison. when I read that letter, and he referred to the fact that she was one from a family of 8 girls and 6 boys, all who did very well in their various spheres in life, is what he wrote in the letter. And I wrote to him, I found the letter in the early 90s, and I wrote to him at the address that was on the letter and asked him a little bit more about her, because I was researching in women who had been imprisoned in Kilmainham jail, but I didn't get a response because the letter had been written some 30 years before. And so, piecing together the story from archives, and again, I know there are family members here today, so they might be able to help me a little bit, is the eldest child was Maire, who was one of the people I'm going to talk about today, and she was born in 1876. She married Dermot O'Donovan, but they didn't have a family. Then there's a gap in the family, and there's possibly that there were, I'm just estimating in terms of sort of spacing of children, 2 boys. What happened a lot, we see it clearly in the census returns, is that often if the child was born, stillborn, a lot of the mothers considered that they had that child, even if they hadn't been baptised, they counted that child, of course, among their other children, but that doesn't tally with a lot of the figures. So they may have grown up with the knowledge that they had 6 boys in the family, even though they had died perhaps at birth. But I'm only speculating, and maybe somebody could help me out there. So then the next child is Timothy, who was born in 1881, who's also known, I think, as Tig. And then there's Hannah, born in 1883. Julia, who was, I think, must be the same as the Judy that's sometimes mentioned, 1886. And then there's Kate, who was born in 1888, who died in 1961, who's the other person I'm going to speak about, who married Michael O'Callaghan, obviously the Maire of Limerick. And then there's John, born in 1890, Elizabeth, born in 1891, and she's the Eilish, who I'm also going to talk about, who taught in Mary Immaculate College, and she died in 1957 in Limerick, unmarried. And then there's Margaret, who I think is Joan, 1894, who died unmarried. And then Bridget, who's Breed, I think 1896. And then there's Ellen, who's also Elsie Murphy, who I didn't realise for many, many years had been in Kilmainham jail, who had been MO in Kilmainham jail during the Civil War, who I didn't realise was a sister. And that's one of the difficulties, obviously, when you're researching women, because if someone has a family name, you don't necessarily put the story together. And of course, when you're dealing with a name like Murphy, you're not 100% sure that you're dealing with the same family. And then, obviously, the last is Matthew, who obviously was involved himself and active, and he has a witness statement, and we do also have a witness statement from Kate O'Callaghan, but she gave the same story that she'd given before about the shooting of her husband, not a fuller story of what the activity that she had been involved in herself. And then, of course, Elsie married later in life to Kieran O'Driscoll, or when I mean in later life, I have a tendency to say that because everything is before Kilmainham or after Kilmainham jail, and of course a lot of the women were in their 20s, and so you find that, that when you find about them afterwards that they've married after that period of time, you sort of tend to say it's later in life. And Matthew, as I said, is the youngest, and obviously thanks to Matthew's family is the fact that you have the wonderful costume, Irish costume, the Gaelic provided costume, which I'm going to just talk about a little bit about in my talk. So the family themselves, you were very proud of the fact that they were descended from a man by the name of John Murphy. And again, when we talk about all of these things, we have to remember that we're talking in a time before we had access to the genealogy, and the same way that it isn't easy to find these details. So his dates were 1738 to 1826, and this actually appears in one of the obituaries for Maire O'Donovan, which is very unusual because obituaries tend to be quite small, and particularly in relation to women. They don't give detail, but this is very involved and detailed. And so he was from Crossmahon, a townland that they described that had been a townland since the Elizabethan era. So here again you have a people who were talking about the history of their place. So from local to national to international. We know that the sisters were well travelled, but we don't have the evidence for that except for one small thing which I'll talk about in a little while. And I think the parallel with the MacSwineys is important because what was said in this obituary also was that they had a love of religion, they had a love of learning, and they had a love of country. And those two things have come up in the earlier talk, and they're intertwined. And so when you talk about religion, it was also about goodness, as we've looked at here, a Christian ethos. But what's important in relation to the Murphy family is their connections to the religious, and the fact that they had an uncle, Timothy Murphy, who was of the Irish College in Paris. Now this is really, really important because it's the continent, it's the connections that he's making with other religious who go on to become bishops. You have to think about the interconnections in this way. He was later the parish priest of Kilmurry, probably at a crucial period during our history. Again, I don't know that. But what's important for the purposes of this speech is that he was immediately struck by what a scholar that Moira was, and he encouraged her to continue in what was described as the path of learning. And so she went to the St. Angela's, the Ursuline convent, and was considered to be one of the pupils that had established their reputation in 1890. And again, I think what's really important in relation to the schools, and something we haven't looked at, the first thing that I did when I looked at 100 years of women in politics and public life, and I looked at the story of the 114 TDs in particular, I wanted to establish where they went to school. So I did it for the first time because I had to do a lot of primary research on that. And then I did an overview about the most political schools. And the Ursuline school does feature, but actually what comes to the top of the table, and again this is not an exact science, is that the Dominican convent in Eccles Street goes to the top of the table as the most political school in the country. Outpacing Mount Anvil and Alexandra College and all of those, because if you add in senators, it skews the findings, so I'm only looking at TDs, and then they rise up in the rankings. But what's really interesting about the Dominican convent in Eccles Street is that it's actually where Kate O'Callaghan went to study later on. I contacted St. Angela's about their records to see if I could find, did all the sisters go to school there, and I had a very interesting conversation with Niall around this time, and he was very helpful in the early research to try and put this together also from his researches in UCC about the younger members of the family and where they went to university. But he talked to me about the idea of the railroad for the younger family members and how they could have gone in and out of Cork in an ease, and it actually has made me think a lot about the railway system within rural Ireland, because even in the case of where my father's family are from, he would travel by train to a local village now where you have to go roads and it doesn't seem to be a straight line. And so when we think about the system of how people connect with each other, they were actually quite modern. They're nearly like the Lewis people. They are jumping on and off trains and going into college and school, and so we have to really look at that sort of structure and economic setup. And the other thing which is really important in relation to this family is, quite apart from maybe the influence of the learned person within the family through the religious, as I said, with Timothy Murphy, Father Timothy Murphy, but it's also in relation to the extra cash. You have a huge family, and your mother is producing the children and continuing to have babies, and so how then does the eldest children seem to see that they're going to have the same level of equality as they go through the family? And interestingly, again, what you mentioned earlier in the talk, Anne, is the idea that there was no differentiation in this family between boys and girls. We see the same thing with Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, and it's what it is, it's the big farmer class. And again, what we have to remember is, in a period when it was still involving in, a lot of people had to pay a little bit of extra money for tuition, or maybe for travel, as I've just described, for school, the importance of the Murphy family seems to be that they had a forge. and that would have allowed them. I think we discussed that, Niall, and I think you were really helpful with me in that understanding. And then later on, when I was looking at other families that facilitated their young daughters to go on to further education and secondary school education, what I then looked for in each of those families was that additional money that allowed for that to happen. And in the case of Joan Burke, who was a TD in the 1960s through to the 1980s, her grandmother, again in Cork, had actually bought an old house, like a big house, from one of the English officers who was leaving. They had a ballroom in it, and she actually ran Cayley's in that particular house, and it was the ticket price on the door that sent Joan and some of her siblings to school. But in that family, the story was that there was a degree of anger because only some of the children were selected for further education, and we don't see that in the Murphy family. So what's interesting about it again is understanding the parents and the greater and the wider family about the fact that they were going to give equally. And of course then down the line, one of the younger children, Elsie, actually becomes a doctor. So again, if they had actually chosen, the first of the family, maybe they, that she would have lost out. So what happened was, in relation to the eldest, Moira, was that she went to Cambridge. So again, when we talk about people interconnecting, they do know each other. And that's really interesting. Again, if somebody wanted to ask a question about this interconnection, there's just some other references that I'd like to bring out in terms of, the unexpected element of people knowing each other. So again, they were mixing in this school in Cambridge because he was giving teacher training at the time. But by the time that Kate came along, being that little bit younger, she actually went to Eccles Street. And so you'll see here, so I'm getting to the same point. So it was not quite, all the books tell us that the Royal University is established in 1908. So this was in the NUI, and you can see that it's 1904. You can see that she's using the Dominican convent in Eccles Street, and she's calling it the St. Mary's University. And so what's important here is that you can see the subjects she's taking, and she's taking Celtic, or Celtic, which is Irish, and that one of the things that was said about her sister was that she was one of the first ever to take that as a subject, as well as Greek and Latin. And again, we see the connection again into the MacSwiney. So the idea that you had to have Greek and Latin for access to certain things, it wasn't always available to people, and certainly science wasn't available to all women, and we know that right up until the 1980s, that some schools weren't offering that in girls only schools, but you had to go to the local boys' school to avail of that. So that was a long time in coming. But what was really important again is the mixing between the English, mathematics, philosophy, as you can see, and Irish and Latin. So the same subjects are coming through in relation to both people. So what happens next? Well, the main thing that we know about them is that Moira was asked by the bishop. She was actually teaching in Cambridge. So she had gone again to teach in Cambridge in a place called Furnace Lodge. And we know about Irish people. Irish people cluster together. They would have known each other there. They were both from Cork, and we know that how much the bonds of Cork in particular as a place. And they would have sought each other out. They would have also had the interconnection of religion. And this was run by Loreto nuns. And so she doesn't come back to Ireland until 1903, and I was able to go through the records of a Mary Immaculate College. They're very scant, unfortunately, and this is where I got these postcards from. They have a tiny archive, but you can see from the payments that she is, in fact, the first non-religious within the school. What she's doing in terms of the school aren't clear, but we know that she became, what the title was, Professor of Teaching Methods. So, at the time of the establishment of Mary I, it was established by the bishop. He made the case for Limerick because at the time there was a college in Belfast, and obviously there was teacher training in Dublin, but he was talking about how strong it was necessary for Munster to get it, and he won because of the interconnection of the railway, the stops that you could come from. You could come from Clare, and you could come from Tipperary. You could also come up from Kerry if required, and that's why he ended up getting it, and it was run by the Mercy nuns. But what's interesting about this particular place is that you can sort of see how, like a boarding school, it is run at this stage. You can see the science lab here, so in terms of it, and you can see how sparsely decorated. Some of the rooms are, but obviously the religious images are very, are very prominent here. So you get a real sense of it being very much like somewhere between a convent in some of the rooms and that. And so the idea of letting in a non-religious person in here at this point is significant. And this is part, I love this, is part of the infirmary. It's not the whole infirmary. And what they had a lot of the time in this teacher training college was they were bringing teachers who were already teaching in the primary schools around in isolated parts of the country. As we know, if you go to even beaches in Mayo, you'll find there's a lovely little school that was there, and today it's even remote, maybe a 10-kilometre drive from the nearest little village. And so what it is that they were being brought together and their education was being formalised. They were giving almost accreditation that actually fed into their pensions and what was happening. So in this period in time, you're getting people who are already established in the communities, who want to get this incremental pay, and they attend Mary I or one of the other colleges in order to get it. So what you would find with Maire is that she's dealing with people that probably a lot of the time are older than she is. So she would have had to be particularly strong in order to be confident in her own background to be able to take on this particular role. And this is the chapel that obviously is still in use. So it was interesting when I went down there to look at the archive. I was sort of taken aback because there were groups of students using the pews to talk to each other and have it like little meeting, like a little meeting room, which was very, very different at the time. But it's so central to the college even now that it seemed to be a sort of another sort of breakout space in that way. So this particular book came to me a number of years ago. I was speaking at the KHAA weekend. I was speaking about KHAA. I was speaking about growing up in Limerick, and I also mentioned, because my first book was on Lady Lavery, and she's actually referenced as someone who read early drafts of this for George Bernard Shaw. But these two books came from the library at St Margaret's, and I'm saying the library at St Margaret's because they may have belonged to Kate or they may have belonged to her sister Eilish. But what we said in relation to the same thing in relation to the earlier talk is the case is that once political, always political, once interested, always interested, and just because we don't have an archive of letters and content, what's frustrating about this story is that we know that the material existed. We know that the correspondence was once there, but it doesn't exist in any archive. And so as a result, the story of the Murphy sisters isn't as well known even within Mary I itself and their influence. So what I would like to see at some point over the next 2 or 3 years is that they would name a building within that complex just after the Murphy sisters. And we have an interesting thing. It's like, of course, I was claiming them, of course, for Limerick, but of course they also should be claimed for Cork again. And what's important is really also is that the importance of a plaque on a wall. That people do read plaques and people do remember. And archived in Mary I, there are not that many pieces, but again, this is just a ledger from the time. The rules, and it's very poor quality, but this is the lecture room rules. And it's written on a board in that way, and again, it tells you that. But I'll move quickly along because I've spent a little bit more time, and I really want to get to the rest of the story. But these are the items that survive in relation to the teaching methods. So when you're talking about a professor of teaching methods, they are introducing Montessori, they are bringing in colours, they are bringing in sort of, these are examples of, shapes and cylindrical boxes and sandpaper figures, whatever they are, and then the fabrics, and then these are different cards. I'm a primary school teacher. I do not know that the Murphy sisters were members of the Munster Women's Redhouse League, like we know that Mary MacSwiney was, and I think taxation without representation is tyranny. What was really important at the time is the references in the obituaries that they were working towards the suffrage movement, and Kate O'Callaghan herself says in the Dáil that she had been interested in the rights of women from girlhood. And so when you formally join an organisation, you sign up and you pay your due, or you become a member of a committee. You tend at times to be a particular type of person. If you end up part of an organisation and you attend all the meetings but you don't sign in or you don't do all those things that give you that sort of record. I often say to people now when I'm talking about source material is, a lot of the time when you do something bad, you're recorded. So the police record you, prisons record you, the hospitals record you, social workers record you, and all those things. But when you're just sort of doing something and you're going about your daily life and you're not signing something or giving money or paying for something, you're overlooked. So I would say to you that I'm sure these women were involved in this, but if they were involved in a formal, organised suffrage movement, I cannot tell you because we haven't found the evidence. But they would have really been aware of the type of, you know, and this is it. When they talk now about it and they talk about sound bites, and they talk about, you know, grabbing headlines and all of that. This is obviously Hannah Sheehy-Skeffington's book, who of course was born in Kanturk as well, another Cork woman. But they were actually challenging people into the whole thinking of suffrage and how they were approaching people. So, is a woman a person? The law says yes. When she has to pay taxes, they say no. If she's asked to vote how her money shall be spent, is this fair? And then this idea is women are, in South County Dublin, electors, women can canvass, why can't they vote? Votes for women. And so what was really important at this particular moment is that for the Irish Women's Franchise League, we've heard a lot about those who are militant, who were, let's say, breaking windows, you know, who were, and in the case of the English suffrage movement, they were planting bombs and they were destroying golf courses and all of that. But the vast majority of people were very interested in having a vote to be able to participate in the running of the countries. And these women, Moira, and then later on Mr. Kate, and then later on again Aidan, were very involved with being influencers as educators. And so I'm not surprised that they would have been involved in that and that they eventually ended up in politics. But politics is very complicated at this particular time, as we know, and this is a postcard of the time because John Redmond didn't believe in giving the women the vote for political reasons, and in terms of the balance of power, it's very topical, in the House of Commons. So where people were joining movements at the time, and they believed in the thinking of the time, at times their politics got in the way of it, because of course many people were nationalists, didn't believe in the movement for women's votes until after we had established our own parliament. And of course Kate O'Callaghan eventually ended up central to that. But just to refer back to the idea of her teaching, she ended up in Mary Immaculate College because her sister got married, and what better way than to give a person who had a similar amount of intellect. They already trusted the Murphys, and they also were very conscious of the fact that they were getting people who had the same religious ethos. So her sister immediately was taken on in her place and took the same role that she has taken. And in the earliest stages, so Moira went and married Diarmuid O'Donovan, who is obviously related to the same family that are O'Donovan Rossa, and also of the Rowers. That's the family. And he was an interesting man because he had moved to Limerick. I'm sure, being from Cork, he struggled a little bit in the beginning to leave his native Cork, but he was an expert in butter manufacture. And just to say briefly to you, at the time, you have to remember how strong an economy that they went to in Limerick. I mean, if you think about it, there were massive warehouses in Limerick. You know, they had Cannocks, they had Todd's, they had McBurney's, even as 3 department stores in the centre of Limerick at the time. It was a really prosperous town. Cleves was employing 1,000 people. There was massive butter and warehouses and margarine manufacturers in Limerick. So it was a very thriving place. And he had trained in Denmark. So she was marrying really, really well to a man who was really well established. But they seem to have connected through the Gaelic League. And Moira in particular had an interest in drama. And so when it comes time that her sisters are socialising in Limerick, they in turn meet people through the Gaelic League. And that is probably, even though we don't know this for definite, that Kate O'Callaghan met Michael O'Callaghan, who was even a better catch. They had a tannery in the city, and he was very well appointed. And so the idea then is that when they become involved in politics, as a visiting American priest said of them, they were very cultural. So this couple, I'm sorry, I have a photograph out of sequence. I have to find you this first, sorry. I was talking politically before I said. So she married Michael O'Callaghan in 1914, and then of course when she left Mary Immaculate Training College, Ailish, their sister, came, and from then on Ailish lived with the O'Callaghans in their house. It was called St Margaret's on what is now O'Callaghan Strand, just over the Wesley Bridge, or the Sarsfield Bridge, which was for many, many years the only bridge over Limerick, but now there is obviously another bridge. So just go through here. But I was just saying earlier on that I was trying desperately to sort of find items related to her, and the lady who had very kindly, who was also has its name, Kate O'Callaghan, when she bought the books from the collection in the house, which she very kindly gave me one as a gift, she also purchased these paintings. Now she reframed them, but they're prints from Japan. And so I don't know whether or not when they were married that Kate O'Callaghan and Michael O'Callaghan travelled extensively. I know that they were intending to spend a month in France around the time after he was mayor in Limerick, but he decided he had business to attend to. They remained in Limerick, and that's how he actually was shot. If they had taken the trip that they were meant to take, he may have survived. But what's important about this idea of culture is that when people were talking about the Murphy sisters being cultured, it wasn't just Irish culture, it was the fact that they were probably very well travelled. And it's interesting that Anne was referring also to the idea of someone being well spoken, that idea of the Oxford accent of some of the women we know, and other members of, so the likes of the Honorary Albinia Broderick, Governor New Bruder, who also spoke like she was speaking in Oxford and Cambridge all rolled into one, or so they said. So we all know that in 1921 the tragic death of Michael O'Callaghan put Kate O'Callaghan in not only into the presidency of Cumann locally for 1 year, she only accepted it for 1 year, but it also plunged her into a political life. So just to go back here for a second, yeah, sorry, this is all out of sequence. This is a detail of a photograph from the Hasselbeck collection, and it's Kate O'Callaghan, her lady's maid, a dog and a cat, and her sister. I think this is Ailish with her. And what's really interesting about this is obviously it was done for a publication of some sort, but it's the only photograph that I could find of St Margaret's, and that would have been along O'Callaghan Strand. What's really important about this moment is that it's very unusual actually that you'd have your photograph taken with your lady's maid. But the reason that I think that this photograph was taken is because the lady's maid witnessed what happened in terms of the shooting, because the police came into the house and the RIC. There's no mention anywhere of Ailish, although she lived in the house with them, that she was there. But this is just the reason I think that the three of them are outside the house. And that's why it's there, because it doesn't make sense as a picture otherwise. So just to go through here, so one of the things that Kate O'Callaghan did was she wrote her account. It's a very straightforward account. She's literally telling it as it is. There's not anything added to it about who she is or who her husband is. When she's asked later on, she has a sort of a set description of who he is, but she doesn't feature in any of those writings. But what was important about this is this followed on from Hannah Sheets Gaffington doing a booklet which was called British Militarism as I Have Known It, which was distributed across the world and did much to highlight the situation of Irish people, and in the same way that this informed the American Commission that was mentioned earlier on. So when it came to the time of the election of the second Dáil, you can see that this is Mrs. Pearce, Kate O'Callaghan, very tired and almost elderly Countess Markovich now, only a few years, and then a fellow Limerick woman, Kathleen Clark. What's interesting about the involvement of her sister is that Moira Donovan became deputy mayor, but she ended up as mayor of Limerick during the worst of the time of the campaign of independence, when the mayor was in America raising funds. And what's really important about the family is that there is no picture of her when she's mayor, and it's really frustrating because it's almost like she's airbrushed out again out of that story. And when they keep referring to the deputy mayor is because it was really important at the time that they would keep the idea that their mayor was in America fundraising, and so it means that the deputy mayor, although she actually was mayor, and she's the one who was presiding when Eamon de Valera and Kathleen Clark were given freedom of the city of Limerick. And I know I'm jumping a lot because I'm moving along, but this is a fantastic photograph that is in the military archives, and it's all numbered. And I just thought it's great because, of course, we've got Cathal Brugha here in here, and you've got Mrs. Pearce again, and then you've got Mrs. Clark, and you've got Aidan English again, and then you've got the Countess, and then this is Kate O'Callaghan here in this group photograph. And this is so she chose to exit the Dáil and remained as part of that second Dáil, as I explained to you earlier on the picture. You can tell how mixed up my slides are. She ended up arrested along with Maire MacSwiney in 1923 and ended up in Kilmurry jail, was on hunger strike also for a period of time. She resurfaces again, writing to Eamon de Valera around the time of the Constitution, and talking about how that she feels that it's so limiting in the role of women, and that material, that information, that letter is in the Department of Taoiseach. But I just wanted to refer back, just briefly, if I could, to the notion that she was also in the Dáil when Eamon de Valera demoted Countess Markievicz from being a member of cabinet, and both Maire MacSwiney and Kate O'Callaghan stood up protesting that this was a retrogressive step. And of course we know it took 60 years before we had our next cabinet minister. So what it is she was always aware. In 1949 there was a brief mention of the fact that she gave a speech on O'Connell Bridge when Ireland was declared a republic. In the material that's in the archive in Mary I, there is the memorial card of Ailish, who predeceased her sister in 1956. This is the history recalled by the death of women of Deputy Maire, is the wonderful article I described to you. And then this is a picture of Kate O'Callaghan when she died in 1961. Moira died, even though she was much older, she died the previous January. She was just 73 and she'd been widowed for 70 years. I just wanted to include these really quickly to describe the idea, as I said to you, that education and influence comes in all sorts of things. And I know some of you may not have the chance to see this dress behind the cloak, and the detailing of it is incredible. This is haute couture, Irish style. It would have been really expensive in this day, and it was put together by the Twomey Industries. But as Anne very eloquently said earlier on, that is a subject for another day. And I've already seen my 1 minute. And then, so these are just the images of these are the images of Sinead de Valera and Anya Kant wearing the same thing. And then there's also one that isn't as attractive, and I'm doing a pitch here for your committee. There are other dresses, and there is one that's in the Jackie Clark collection, which I managed for a number of years, which is Linda Cairns, which I gave to an exhibit in Germany for a while. But as you can see, it's not half as attractive as the other dress, so Kate O'Callaghan stands out. But just to end, I did explain to you already about the book that I was given, but the other thing that I have, I'm actually wearing it today, and that is, this is a medal from Féile Núini, and when I was about 9, I won a medal for Irish poetry, and I've always had a love of drama and interest in that area since, and that's my link to Kate O'Callaghan. She and her sisters were founders of not only the Thomond Archaeological Society, but they were also Gaelic League, Carrigal Holt, the Irish College, but also Féile Núini. And the reason that the nuns in my school were an Italian order, the Salesians, were so pro Féile Núini and had us in every single competition was because Kate O'Callaghan, as wife of Maire, was responsible for them being established in Limerick. Her husband gave them coal in that very cold winter during the campaign of independence, and her sister Ailish gave them the examination papers because they weren't official yet by the Department of Education. And so I was so taken with Irish history and Irish culture, imbued in me by Italian nuns, but it came from Kate O'Callaghan. Thank you very much indeed.
As Aidan said there, we have a few short minutes before we get you out to your lunch to maybe ask the ladies to take a few questions from the floor. Do you want, Sinead, do you want this? Do you want to take a seat there, or maybe take the floor as some questions? Hopefully there'll be some things that will have teased people's interest. So maybe about 10 minutes before we get you to lunch there. Great, there's a question here.
First of all, I think I speak on behalf of everybody. I would sincerely like to thank Dr. McCoole for a really excellent and illuminating and very well-presented speech on KHAA. As you all know here, we were very proud to have our costume first of all in Dublin Castle for quite a while last Christmas, and then it went on to Limerick and gave it a lot. It got a lot of very fair, justifiable comment on the media generally. I'm also very proud to say that we actually have here alongside me Sheila Murphy, who is one of the Murphy's craftsmen. So I'd like you all to give her a big round of applause. To have somebody like you, Sheila, here, who's directly in line and living so close to us. So I won't say any more. Again, and I'd like to thank you and Twomey for a fantastic lecture as well. There's been so much. We're inundated with wealth today. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Any questions for either of our speakers?
It's interesting to hear the story of these enormously influential women, and yet when De Valera did finally bring out our women were written out. Why?
Okay. What's the short answer? Do you want your
We've only got 10 minutes.
No, I think what's really important to remember is that we're only now in the last decade being in a position to be able to look at history and, let's say, peel back more layers and to be able to write it in a particular way. And the other thing that has opened up is that that Anne coming through local history. We're all standing in this building because you have an interest in local history. So history has opened up beyond academia to being local history. And what's happened now with the decade of commemorations is it's been handed over to the local authorities for the people to tell their own stories. And there's a huge recognition, and there has been for years, that the local school teacher or the local, maybe the local solicitor who's interested in history or that was a font of knowledge, but he wasn't or she wasn't given the status of having a sort of a true history. So when I went to university to study history, and I did modern Irish history, and I then went on to do a master's in modern Irish history, I actually never heard the word Common Amon. And I went back over my lecture notes to sort of see whether I was incorrect. And I wrote an article recently, and actually Maire MacSwiney features very prominently in it, in that I went over to see what was said about the women by all of still our existing commentators. I'm very, very fond of Jolie myself, but Roy Foster, Jolie, and all of those major history books actually refer to women in footnotes and also refer to them emotionally. In 2017, an article was written online for UCD History's Decade of Commemoration. And again, this is not anti-male, but it was written by a male historian, but I'm just pointing it out that it was inaccurate. And they talked about Maire MacSwiney's lengthy speech in the Dáil that went on for 2.5 hours, and they used the word, if I'm saying it, is a diatribe? Diatribe? Yeah. And they actually were using the words that were written by P.S. O'Hegarty, who wrote his book in the late 1920s. And the reason he had to come down so hard on Maire MacSwiney was because she still had a following and she still had a weight. And so what it is that you're asking the question about women, but it's also a question that we're seeing about families, where which member of the family did you talk about? Which member of the family was given prominence? And I went to see people, I'm sorry, it's a very long answer, I went to visit people in the 1990s who started to talk to me about their mothers. But if I went into a family where there had been a man whose father had been involved, the woman's story was completely dismissed. She was making the tea for me in the kitchen, and I was listening to the other stories, and it was very hard to bring the women back in again. And I'm not saying that in terms of it, it's to do with who's telling the story, who's hearing the story, who's remembering the story. And I think the great thing about Ireland is there was masses of material kept, but my plea is that if people still have material, and it's happening, is to give it into archives, because it's only in the accessibility of it. But Cecile Gordon has shown through the military archive, the role of women is far larger than we ever thought possible all those years ago. So the material is there, and it's changed the course of Irish history. And congratulations on your book. I'm delighted that you've done it. The more that's out there, the more that's written. So thank you.
I'll stand up because I'm kind of hidden behind the thing there. It's just, you mentioned about Bunrock na HÉireann, and when I was teaching about it in class a few years back, it was very interesting. What came up was that, and my class is predominantly, they're all adults, but they're predominantly female, and there was a big reaction. Went through all the articles of it and was for and against it. But when it came to the things about the women, there was absolute uproar in the classroom, and they were shocked at the whole idea that this had happened and this had passed, and who passed it? Had we any vote at the time? But what they discovered in their course of their study was one of the groups that was so virulent against Devon, it was the ICA, the Irish Country Women's Association. They were one of the few groups of women who stood and tried to challenge him on it, and actually found him a very, very hard man to kind of even get, when he would come. We have a little film clip, it's fascinating, of them running a fire drill, and he's standing stony-faced at the thoughts that these are women doing this job. So it was a perception of the time as well, you know. And I take Sinead's point on the way men looked at women in history, and as I'm a fan of Jolie, I did my master's under him in that, but she's right in the sense that our story is always underhidden in comparison to the men. I mean, you only have to look at, they're talking about Dublin footballers as one of the great football teams of all time. I'm sorry, but the Cork ladies women team have won 10 All-Irelands, you know, and it's sort of out there, you know, and that's unfortunately the perception. But we are challenging it, and people, it's a lovely thing that when you're in classrooms and you're in talks, even just recently someone came up to me about something else and said, thank God somebody's speaking about women, and you know, we're just putting things together, but it's the idea that the thing is balanced. But the Bunrock na HÉireann is a very interesting question, and again, it's also a historical question because it shows what happened culturally and socially to Ireland between the 30s and the 50s. There was a shutting down, there was a narrowing of the social norms and a rigidity of where everybody's place was. To a certain extent that had economic roots, but on a broader sense it was a very cultural thing. And it took very strong families to challenge some of those accepted cultural norms, and in families where maybe a father and mother worked very well together and decided that the children, whether they were male or female, would get the best chances. Lots of families found it that it was easier to settle into I came across something about farming women. I was listening to it, a woman, and it was really interesting, coming from a very city background. I'm always fascinated to learn about other people's things. And when she was the girl in the family, she was the eldest, like Mary MacSwiney. Now, it would be now the case that she should inherit, but in those days, no, that wasn't the case. And she had done all the work on the farm. Everybody knew she had farming in her veins. And I went to some second or third cousin down the road because he was a man. And I was now in the sick bed of the day, and I actually nearly revived me. What? But again, you know, as Jolie used to say, put your feet into the shoes of the time, and that was very much accepted. And Bunrock na HÉireann is a testament to that. There are some very good things in it too, but that part, no.
I have a question for Anne, but based on what Sinead was saying about her own work on that you've obviously done great insight into the educational backgrounds of the women who went on to be public representatives in the Oireachtas particularly, but from the work that you've done locally, most of the ladies are probably less well known or unknown names.
Yeah.
Have you any insight from your work, and I know there are others who are in the group as earlier, as to their educational backgrounds and whether they were so fortunate?
The thing with the book was, and I suppose that's why it's called, the original exhibition was Ordinary Women, in the sense, it wasn't meant in a derogatory sense, it was meant in the sense that they could have been anybody. There were factory workers, there were shopkeepers, there was somebody's mother, there was somebody's sister. And so there was a range of social background, and you could see that a number of the women who came from, say, working class, what you would call working class backgrounds, their educational level stopped at primary, principally because of the reason Sinead said secondary school was you had to pay for it. And that would have been their experience in terms of, you know, formal education. what I found about, and I think the group found as well, and I hope they don't mind that I'm speaking on their behalf, was that these ladies' stories, what I found very interesting was the partnerships in it, the male and the female partnerships through the rough days of the War of Independence and into the Civil War. And Fionnula McCurtain herself said at the launch of the book that in her case, she came across the idea that her grandfather, her grandmother, her father, her mother, they walked side by side, not behind, not one in front and one behind the other. And it seemed to me that this was a great time in terms of partnerships, male and female. And then the terrible tragedy was after the Civil War, the way the rigidity came in, and that sense of women falling back out of public life. And in lots of cases, what a lot of these women did was it was as if they appeared on the scene and then they just seamlessly drifted back into the sidelines and carried up the threads of their former life where they could, or emigrated because it wasn't a comfortable country to live in anymore, you know. It was kind of sad.
Any other questions before?
How much influence had the Catholic Church on rural women?
On rural women?
On
the role of women?
Yes.
I would say a huge influence personally, but at the same time, I'm looking back on it and I'll say a child in the 60s. I know that my mother would have been born sort of in the late 30s, but I remember when she told us this story, we thought it was really fascinating. Apparently you had to be churched after having a baby. Yeah. I said to her, how do you mean church? If I was another procedure that I was definitely going to put off till I was in my 50s. And she said it was a cleansing thing, right? Almost an idea that there was something unclean about you. So anyway, apparently this priest arrived into wherever she was after giving birth to me at the time, and she was younger than us, she said, and she just, he said to her, you know, Joan, no, before we do anything but the Christianity, no, I'll church you. I beg your pardon, she said. So he said, I'll church you. What are you? And so he explained to her. And in what way would it be a sin? She told us we all had to marry before we could ever have children or whatever. So he said, well, Joe, you'll do no such thing, she said, and the child will be baptised and I'll be returning to Mass when and good and ready. Can I say a prayer with you? We can do that, all right, but it will be for the baby. I don't need any cleaning from you. And they were the women of the 60s who are in their 80s now. They began that challenge that we see all around us. And I think that in the 20s and 30s and 40s, for economic reasons in lots of ways, the church was allowed to have huge influence in areas that really it shouldn't have. And I can even remember when Des and myself finally decided we'd get married, and I said, I'm doing no pre-marriage course, I don't need anybody, you know, you're either doing it now, today, and I'm not doing it ever again. So we had a priest in college who was lovely, Father Corkery, and I said to him, okay, no, right. We spent the whole time talking about GAA, Nemo Rangers, unfortunately, but we let that slide past because he was of that. And then I said to him, look, I suppose we should say, in the name of God, and see, tis you're getting married. I'm a single man. How would I know what's going on? And I thought, you'll do me. And you see, all of that kind of attitude needed to come through, really. And they were allowed to have not so much opinions, I'd have no problem saying having an opinion, but they were given a sense of entitlement and rules and regulations in areas where they should never have had, really. You know, I really think that.
Sinead, do you want to say words to that?
Just to finish that, I used to think that this was common knowledge, but most people, I just discovered it isn't really. That John Charles McQuaid was the one who changed the content of the. He wasn't Archbishop at the time. He was a member of the staff at Blackrock College. So you can actually see it. Actually, we have it as part of the film in our exhibition, where you can actually see the changes that are made to that constitution. The thinking at the time, though, was that it was a good thing, because the idea of women being in the home was to protect them so that they wouldn't have to go out to work. And I always think that was in some ways obviously influenced by the church, but it was about De Valera, whose mother had sent him home to Ireland to be brought up, and she had stayed on in America for economic reasons, and then ended up having another family. So he was somebody who had experienced that in that way. So people didn't protest against it. It did pass, not by a huge majority, but it still passed. The people who were most vocal were the women who had been the suffragettes and the women who were the university association, and they went to such an extent that there were protests with 1,000 women coming from, you know, they say from offices around the Dublin city centre to protest in the Mansion House. But as I showed you earlier on in the piece, it was the cover of the Dublin Opinion, the haunting of De Valera by the Maeve in Grania. So he was getting a backlash, and there's a wonderful piece that came from a lady called Joyce Padbury, and her father was an ad writer for the Irish Press. Now she doesn't know anything about it. She found it in her mother's drawer when she was tidying up after her mother passed away, and it's a compact. It's it dates to, and it has a inscription on it from 1938, and it's a souvenir of Constitution Day. So it's powder puff inside of it. It's done in the shape of an envelope, and they've used the Constitution stamp actually as on the thing. It's really expensive. You'd have no idea that it was that early if you found it on eBay. You'd think it was much later, except for that it's dated. And the reason that it's written Constitution Day with a small d, so it isn't government. It's probably party. He did work for the Irish Press, so we're speculating on this, but there are two files which I haven't looked at in the National Archives which are describing a Constitution Day that didn't happen. They rushed through the Constitution at the end of 1937, and it was supposed to be passed in 1938, and it was supposed to be a big deal, but the lobby of women, the ones who spoke out, were vocal enough that they suppressed the Constitution Day and the compact that was never given out to the women to publicise the Constitution. So that's just a story.
Thank you very much. By the way, I forgot when giving my notes earlier before we went out for lunch to mention, and Sinead was too modest to say that Sinead also launched a book, actually also on Tuesday night, I believe. So both our speakers were launching books on Tuesday night. I knew it's your first venture to writing a play, I think.
Yeah. So it's a story based on a true thing. So
and
that's only a small thing.
there are copies of this also on sale outside during your lunch. Do you want to tell people? Yeah. So basically, there is food downstairs.